Let's now bring in the African Regional Director of Amnesty International, Muthoni Wanyeki, now joining us live from our City Center studios. Madam, good evening, good afternoon from here at the studio. Isn't this blanket report by Amnesty International, doesn't it condemn the entire of the East African region as being the same in terms of human rights? If you can just put that into perspective for us.
Just to be clear, it's not really about condemning. This is, the report is based on documentation in 159 countries, including the countries of East Africa, the Horn and the Great Lakes. And basically all of those 159 countries have work to do in terms of improving their human rights record. Obviously, our region is marked by growing intolerance of dissent, real struggles and human rights violations arising from questions of how to deal with political inclusion, transition questions, succession questions, particularly around elections, all of which sort of, in many of our countries, have gone into armed conflict, actual armed conflict. And what we're talking about is also the deficits of the architecture, the peace and security architecture, the relevant RECs, the EAC, IGAD, and the AU to actually contain and deal with these conflicts arising from grievance.
And talking about our region, the Eastern Africa region, have things been improving over the last couple of years, or have they been getting worse?
Well, I think what we pull out from the country reports is sort of a backsliding. The pendulum really seems to have swung. That's global. Again, it's not just us. I think domestically in many countries that used to be strong supporters around human rights, we've seen that kind of backtracking. If you go through the report, there are pretty strong indictments of the EU, there are pretty strong indictments of France and what's happened under the state of emergency there. There's an indictment of Russia, of the US, as well as, and I think what that backtracking domestically has done has meant a lack of leadership in multilateral forums, failure to deal with mass atrocities, whether we're talking about Syria or closer to home, South Sudan. So, and it's emboldened, I think, in many ways, the governments in our region, this sort of Western, Northern backtracking. So yes, I do think things are rather worse than they were.
What has talked about conflict and authoritarianism as some of the reasons for the poor records here in Eastern Africa. Then what kind of work needs to be done to improve this record?
Well, first of all, I think we need to all get a lot better at listening to why people are protesting. If you look at the state of emergency in Ethiopia, for instance, what started it off? It's protests around political exclusion. It's protests around land grievances that spread from one region to another region and now is present in 3 regions. And rather than sort of trying to deal with the human rights grievances that underlie what becomes instability, the tendency of states is really to try and crack down, contain it, repress. We've seen that in Burundi. Definitely the government has now reasserted its control, but it's done so in a fairly repressive way. The opposition is in exile, human rights defenders are in exile. So the situation looks calm on the surface, but have we really dealt with the underlying issues? No. So what needs to really happen is sort of pay attention to the human rights grievances that are driving people's dissent, allow it, and find constructive public policy ways. Human rights are not just dealt with in legal ways. Public policy ways to address what people are actually calling for.
Right. If we try and narrow down this report to here in the country, to Kenya, the issue of refugees has been mentioned. How bad is it for us as Kenya?
I mean, on the one hand, no one can deny Kenya has been home to, almost, 600,000 refugees, 250,000 mainly from Somalia. No one can deny that Kenya has, in the past and historically, been home and given shelter and respected international obligations on asylum seeking. However, in the last year, what we saw were very ill-considered attempts to scapegoat, particularly refugees and asylum seekers who happen to be Somali, to link them, sort of group discriminate against them by basically blaming all of them as a group for problems of insecurity that we have in the countries, problems of Shabab, instead of again asking, it's true, Shabab is present in Kenya, no one can deny that, but why? What is driving young men in particular in the coast, in the north, into groups like Shabab? What are their grievances that have been unaddressed? And you have to have that kind of response as well as just a hard-line security response that actually scapegoats people in need of protection.
All right. So if this region tries to turn around the backsliding, which way would you say, when you assess the situation as Amnesty International, is better? Is it better for Kenya to work on this as a country, for South Sudan, for Ethiopia to work on this as a country, or is it more productive when the whole region does this together?
Well, the region as a whole has already committed to standards around democracy, standards around good governance, standards around human rights. We have the African Charter. We have the African Charter on democracy. The question is, why are we failing to live up to it at the national level? These are African standards. Why are we failing to live up to our own constitutions? As post-conflict countries like Burundi hit the 10-year kind of transitional mark, why is it that all of a sudden we're all sort of biting our nails, sort of going, God, is it going to fall apart all over again? And it really, like I said, it has to do with our political behavior and what we as citizens tolerate in terms of political behavior. We as citizens have to start demanding higher standards, have to start demanding rights agendas in terms of what politicians and public policymakers do, and not sort of all this kind of populist noise around us.
Thank you so much, Muthoni Wanyeki, the Africa Regional Director for Amnesty International. That is